I think we made a good step in the right direction when we gave European citizen data rights. Like, that's definitely the first step. But I think a second step that is needed is to give us collective control over our data. And what I mean by that is that instead of each of us clicking consent buttons and saying yes to terms and conditions we don't really understand, to have something or someone in the middle that allows us to group our rights and have collective power so that we collectively can stand up to the Facebooks and the Googles of the world. And usually when we say that the person in the middle, we start referring to that entity as an intermediary. It's kind of a longer answer. My first point is that I think lowering transaction costs sounds like a really good idea, because costs sound like bad things, and when we lower them, that sounds like a good thing. But often transaction cost could be a bad thing when it really is just friction for no reason, but sometimes it's friction for good reason. For instance, when companies need to respect our data rights, and that causes some friction. I think we don't necessarily want to lower those transaction costs. So that's just for the first part of the question. The second part of the question is more, how can we make sure that we effectively enable people to have those rights, but then also allow, in the cases where we want data sharing to happen, for that to happen more smoothly. So if I interpret that question in that way, I think a way to do that again is to have data intermediaries, as the Commission is suggesting. However, I think it's really important that we don't just drop the word intermediary and kind of be done with it. It's really important to look at who should these intermediaries be, what kind of power should they have, but also how do we then control that power. For instance, I don't want Facebook to be my data intermediary and make decisions about my data for me, even if they are legally required to do that on my behalf, because there's such an enormous conflict of interest between me and Facebook. However, I could completely see an NGO that I trust that has a fiduciary duty to look after my rights, which means that they can only act in my best interest and not also in their own best interest. If they have that legal obligation, then I might be more inclined to say, well, yes, please look after my rights for me. And that would smoothen the process a bit, because instead of me having to figure out every time I want to share data, how I want to share it, and precisely for how long, etc., I now have someone doing that on my behalf. So collective consent really goes to the notion that us individually making decisions about how we want to share data about us doesn't always lead to the best collective results. For instance, when I share data about me, I may inadvertently also be sharing data about other people. And that's not always obvious. It's very obvious, for instance, when I share data about my DNA, because my DNA is also describing my family members and even people who are not yet born. But it could also be that I share data that describes me as part of a group. For instance, some 30-something-year-old hipster. Now suddenly, from me sharing that and from other people like me sharing that, you can start to infer a lot of information about other people in that group that haven't yet shared data about themselves and may have chosen not to for a very good reason. What we do individually has an impact on other people. And so to make sure that that impact is governed and that there is that we collectively agree that that's how we want to do things, we need to not just make individual decisions, we also need a way to come together and decide on these things collectively. This is usually how we do this for social decisions in democratic governments by elected representatives, etc., and we can start imagining models like that for data as well.